Why were you born into a battlefield and not a garden? Why did your first breaths taste like smoke instead of safety? Why were your lullabies the sounds of slammed doors, accusations, or silence so loud it swallowed your sense of self before you even learned your name? What kind of cruel cosmic joke places the most sensitive souls in the hands of the most wounded people? What higher force would look at your bright, tender spirit and say, "Let's bury it in the very soil that's never grown anything gentle"? You've asked yourself that question more times than you've admitted out loud. Maybe you asked it while hiding under blankets that never felt safe. Maybe you asked it in the middle of a dinner table where love was conditional, doled out in teaspoons, revoked in hurricanes. Or maybe you never formed the words, but you've lived the ache. You've moved through life with a subtle vibration of wrongness humming under your skin, like your soul was dropped into the wrong story. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if the furnace you were born into wasn't a punishment, but a prophecy? You see, no one talks about the violence of spiritual preparation, the brutal way divinity sometimes carves out the soul, the way certain souls come here with too much light, and the only way to contain that kind of radiance is to forge a container strong enough to hold it. And that container, it's not built in paradise, it's built in fire. You weren't just born, you were initiated through pain, confusion, betrayal, initiated through watching the people who were supposed to protect you self-destruct right in front of your eyes and sometimes at your expense. You learned early that love could slice as easily as it could soothe, that safety could vanish with one angry look, that presence was never guaranteed even when someone was in the room, and yet you adapted. You learned to read tone before words, energy before action. You developed a radar most people can't even comprehend. You didn't just grow up, you shape-shifted. Because when you're born into a toxic environment, your nervous system becomes your oracle. You don't have the luxury of naivety. You don't float through life wondering if people are safe. You know when they're not. And while that kind of hypervigilance can feel like a curse, it's also the seed of your sensitivity, your power. This world tells you that strength looks like stoicism, like smiles in the face of suppression. But true strength, true power, it looks like a child who lived through hell and didn't become it. A soul that was surrounded by poison but still chose to grow something beautiful inside. A being who was taught fear but now whispers courage into every crack they once hid inside. You didn't choose that home, that family, that town, that trauma, but your soul chose something deeper, the path of transmutation, the road of remembrance, the calling to break generational chains with your presence alone. The ones who come from the furnace carry fire in their bones, not to burn the world, but to illuminate it. And when you've been broken open that early, truth becomes your only home. You stop pretending, you stop performing, you start demanding realness, because you've seen what fake love can do. And maybe that's the hidden reason behind it all. Maybe you had to grow in the dark so you could recognize the light for what it really is. Not performance, not perfection, but peace. And peace doesn't always come dressed in comfort. Sometimes it comes as the unraveling, the collapse, the soul-deep scream that says, "I deserve more than survival." That's not weakness, that's awakening. And the moment you stopped blaming yourself for the fire you were born into was the moment you began to rise from it. They called it love, but it came with sharp edges. It came dressed as sacrifice, but you were always the one bleeding. You learned early that affection had rules, and you were breaking them just by existing too loudly. You were taught to apologize for your sensitivity, to make yourself smaller so someone else's chaos wouldn't erupt. You called it love because that's what they called it, but it felt more like war. You started to brace yourself for kindness because it always came with a hook. Smiles came after storms, only to vanish again. A hug could turn into an accusation. A compliment could twist into control, and you adapted. Of course you did. You learned how to read the energy in the room before you spoke. You learned that love was something you had to earn, perform for, bleed for, and so you became a shapeshifter, a mirror. You turned into whatever they needed you to be, because their love was your oxygen and withdrawal felt like suffocation. You started confusing tension with intimacy. You mistook intensity for connection because that's all you knew. What no one tells you is that children don't stop loving their parents to survive. They stop loving themselves. And that's what happened to you. You silenced your instincts. You doubted your tears. You learned to stay quiet when it hurt. Because if you questioned their love, you'd have to confront the unbearable, that the people you trusted the most were the ones doing the most damage. So you folded. You internalized the chaos. You started to believe that you were the problem, that if you could just be better, quieter, easier, maybe love would stop cutting you open. But even in your silence, something within you refused to die. That quiet knowing, that ache, that sacred whisper inside that said, "This isn't love." That was your soul trying to speak. That was your blueprint resisting distortion. Even while surrounded by manipulation, you remembered. You remembered what love was supposed to feel like, even if you never fully had it. And that memory, that craving, that is not weakness, it is evidence. It is proof that your soul held onto truth in the middle of a lie. It is proof that your sensitivity is not a flaw, but a compass. Because only those who've been fed counterfeit love become masters at recognizing the real thing. Only those who've walked through emotional warfare become fierce guardians of peace. And only those who've been taught to abandon themselves become warriors in the art of return. You didn't just survive weaponized love. You learned its anatomy. You studied its patterns. You broke its spell, slowly, painfully, but completely. And now, you are becoming the love you were denied. You are learning to give yourself what no one ever taught you how to receive. Not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but because your soul finally remembered that love is not meant to wound, it's meant to wake you up. There was a time when the mask wasn't a lie, it was a lifeline. You didn't wear it to deceive, you wore it to survive because the truth of who you were was too much for the room. Too sensitive, too intense, too emotional, too alive. So you trimmed your edges, you softened your fire, you smiled when you were breaking, you stayed quiet when you were screaming inside. And they praised you for it. That's the tragedy of toxic environments. They don't just demand obedience, they demand disappearance. They train you to be palatable, digestible, invisible. You're allowed to exist, but only in pieces. And so you became an expert in disappearing. You learned how to show up without being seen, how to exist without taking up space. You became a reflection of what they needed, what kept them comfortable. And slowly, the mask fused with your face. What began as armor became identity. What started as protection turned into prison. You forgot where the mask ended and where you began. You performed so long that the act became the self. Smiling became muscle memory. Agreeing became instinct. You stayed in relationships that silenced you, in roles that shrank you. You called it loyalty, you called it love, but underneath you were suffocating. Because the soul doesn't forget its shape. No matter how deep you bury your truth, it will rise. In the quiet moments, in the loneliness, in the dreams, in the mirror. There were flashes, weren't there? Moments where you caught a glimpse of the real you, the unmasked you, the one who didn't people please or play small, the one who didn't dilute their feelings just to keep the peace. And in those moments, you felt grief. Because the mask kept you safe, but it also kept you hidden. It shielded you from rejection, yes, but it also blocked you from real connection, because love that reaches the mask never reaches you. Approval that's given to a performance never satisfies the soul, and so you walked through life surrounded by people, yet starving for truth, for intimacy, for resonance, but the mask filtered everything, and then it cracked. Not because you wanted it to, but because it had to. Life, in its cruel mercy, will eventually place you in situations where the mask no longer works, where the pain becomes louder than the performance, where the soul demands its voice back. And when that moment came for you, it wasn't gentle, it was disorienting, terrifying, but also sacred. Because the breaking of the mask is the beginning of the return to self, to breath, to presence, to the original blueprint that was buried beneath the survival script. And yes, the world may not clap for your unmasking. Some may leave, some may reject the real you, but that's how you know it's working. The ones who were only loyal to your performance cannot follow you into your authenticity. And that is freedom. Not the kind that feels comfortable, but the kind that feels like oxygen after a lifetime of pretending. And once you taste that air, you can never go back. It wasn't your chaos they hated, it was your clarity. It wasn't your flaws that unsettled them, it was your truth. You walked into rooms carrying light, and that light reflected everything they were trying to hide. Your presence was a mirror, not a weapon, not a threat, just a reflection. But for people living in denial, even a reflection can feel like violence. You weren't too much, you were just unignorable. And for those who survive by avoiding their pain, someone who insists on being real is unbearable. Your emotions, your questions, your honesty, it all disrupted the illusion. They had built their world on silence, on secrets, on suppression. And here you came, raw, sensitive, asking why things felt off, naming the things they had worked so hard to pretend weren't there. You didn't expose them. They exposed themselves in your light. That's the cruelty of being a powerful soul in a toxic space. You get punished for your purity. You get resented for your awareness. You become the villain in a story you were only trying to tell the truth in. And you begin to wonder if you're the problem, if you should dim, if you should pretend. But every time you try, something in you breaks, because your soul was never meant to be a shadow. You were born to illuminate, to name what others deny, to bring light to the rooms where it was forbidden. But that gift, it often comes wrapped in rejection, not because you are unworthy, but because you are undeniable. And some people cannot tolerate what they cannot control, so they shame it, silence it, push it away. They don't see your truth, they see their reflection in it, and it terrifies them. They'll say you're dramatic, sensitive, overreacting, but that's just projection. What they mean is, I can't handle what you're showing me. You weren't the source of the discomfort. You were the mirror, the symptom, the reminder. And the more you tried to shrink to be accepted, the more misaligned you became, because you were never meant to fit in. You were meant to wake people up, but not everyone wants to wake up. Some would rather destroy the alarm clock than leave the dream. And so, they left. Or you did. Maybe it wasn't dramatic. Maybe it was a slow fading, a series of silences, a growing emptiness that told you your light is not welcome here. And as painful as that is, it's also sacred. Because when a mirror walks out of a room, the people inside are left with only themselves. And that's where your real power begins. Not in convincing them to look, but in refusing to break the mirror for their comfort. You're not here to be palatable, you're here to be true, and truth by nature is disruptive, but it's also the beginning of healing, even if you never see it, even if they never thank you. Your reflection changed the room, even if the room pretended it didn't. There comes a moment where the story breaks, and you see it. Not the memory, but the myth. Not the person, but the pattern. You look back at everything you called home and realize it was a performance, a theater of roles, expectations, emotional transactions. And you played your part so well you almost forgot it was an act. But truth has a way of surfacing, like smoke rising from under the door, and eventually you stop choking it down. That moment when you first realized they never really saw you, it felt like betrayal, but it was the beginning of liberation. Because the hardest part isn't losing people, it's losing the story you built around them, the fantasy, the justification, the idea that they did their best when their best was abuse painted with a soft brush. You're taught to be loyal to your roots, but what if your roots were wrapped around landmines? What if the soil that grew you was laced with denial, shame, and silence? You didn't just wake up one day and feel broken. You were trained into fragmentation, coached into suppression. You inherited a system where love was earned, boundaries were betrayal, and self-expression was dangerous. And still, you stayed. For a long time, you stayed. Because that illusion, it gave you something to cling to, even if it was hollow, even if it hurt, it was familiar. And humans will choose familiar hells over unknown heavens again and again until something finally snaps. Until the illusion gets so loud, so obvious, that it can't hold itself together anymore. That's when the fire starts. Not outside of you, but within. It begins as restlessness, then grief, then rage, not destructive rage, sacred rage, The kind of anger that says, I can't keep lying to myself. The kind that doesn't just want to leave the house, but burn it down. Not the physical home, but the emotional scaffolding, the false sense of belonging, the contracts you never consented to but were bound to anyway. And yes, it's terrifying, because you don't just lose your family's version of love, you lose your version, the one you internalized, the one you used to make sense of your pain. You lose the illusion that it could ever be different, and in that loss, you find something raw and sacred. Clarity. Clarity hurts, it sears, but it cleanses. You begin to unlearn, to unravel, to separate love from obligation, to distinguish safety from silence. And in the ashes of the story you were told, you start writing a new one that doesn't start with, I have to endure, but with, I get to choose. You're not betraying them by leaving the illusion. You're honoring yourself. You're breaking a spell that has been passed down for generations. You're doing what they couldn't. And maybe that's what makes your soul so powerful. Not that you avoided the fire, but that you walked into it willingly because you knew the only way out was through. Pain is a language no one teaches you, but you learn it fluently. You learn its dialects: grief, betrayal, isolation, rage. You learn how to carry it without letting it spill, how to cry without sound, how to ache in silence. And then one day the weight becomes unbearable, not because it grew heavier, but because your soul finally whispered, this is not where it ends. There's a moment in every powerful soul's journey where pain stops being a prison and starts becoming a portal, a doorway, a threshold into something ancient inside you. Not resilience, not just survival, but transmutation. This is the alchemy they never warned you about, the kind that doesn't happen in temples or ceremonies, but in the chaos of your own collapse, when everything you once clung to crumbles and you are left naked with the truth. And in that moment you realize nothing outside of you is coming to save you. No apology, no reunion, no validation, just ashes and choice. Because ashes are not the end. They are the beginning of the real work, the sacred work, the art of turning trauma into truth, pain into purpose, loss into light, not by denying it, but by walking through it, by feeling every layer, every scream, every silence. Until the wound doesn't just close, it transforms. You were never just meant to survive. That was the lie. You were meant to awaken. And awakening is not clean. It is not beautiful. It's violent in its honesty. It rips through your illusions, drags you through your shadows, and leaves you staring into the mirror of your own soul. You see everything, who you pretended to be, who you were told you had to be, and somewhere underneath, who you truly are. And that raw self, that uncovered, trembling self, that's where your power begins. Because when you've sat in the fire of your own undoing and chosen not to numb it, not to bypass it, but to breathe into it, you become indestructible. Not because you're immune to pain, but because you no longer fear it. You've become fluent in it, you've made art from it, and you've turned it into medicine. That's what they don't understand about you. They see your strength and think it was given. But it was earned in the darkness, in the breakdowns, in the nights you thought would never end. You forged yourself in solitude, in silence, in surrender. And that's what makes you different. That's what makes you powerful. Because you didn't just heal, you transmuted. You took everything that was meant to destroy you and made it sacred. You turned your scars into symbols, your grief into depth, your rage into clarity. You became the fire, not the ash. And now when you speak, when you exist, you carry that alchemy with you. You walk into rooms and shift the energy, not because you try, but because you are. You are proof that beauty can rise from ruin, that power can grow from pain, that even in the most toxic soil, something holy can bloom. You are the evidence of transformation. You are the alchemist. There's a silence that doesn't numb, it reveals, not the silence of suppression, but the stillness after collapse. The kind of silence that finds you when there's nothing left to hold on to, no more illusions to protect. It's not peace yet, but it's a sacred pause, the breath before the truth. In this silence, everything echoes. The buried voices, the weight you carried, the ache of the parts you abandoned to keep others comfortable. There's no noise to drown it out now. Just you, raw and real, staring into the mirror of your own becoming, and in that mirror, a flicker of the child you once were, the one who was never broken, only buried. That flicker turns into a flame, and that flame burns through every falsehood you once clung to. This is the beginning of remembrance, and with it comes grief. Grief for every time you betrayed yourself to belong, for every time you stayed silent when your soul screamed for truth. And yet, that grief is sacred. It's proof you're coming back to yourself. It's the mourning of a life you were forced to live for someone else's comfort. It's the eulogy to a version of you that knew how to survive, but forgot how to feel. In the stillness, you realize you don't need fixing. You were never broken. You were surviving. Now you're choosing. And that choice, to listen, to be still, to feel, is the most radical thing you've ever done. Not everyone will understand. Not everyone will stay. But the silence will. And in it, your soul speaks. Not loudly, but clearly. It tells you the truth was never far. It was just buried under noise. And now that the noise is gone, all that remains is truth. You are still here, and that is enough, and more than enough. It's holy. There is a rage that heals, not because it destroys, but because it reveals. You tried to silence it, shrink it, shame it, but it wouldn't die, because that rage wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was the part of you that knew this wasn't love, that you deserved better. It was the sacred heat rising from generations of suppression, betrayal, and emotional erasure. They told you anger was dangerous, but what they feared was your clarity, your refusal to be silenced, your unwillingness to keep making yourself small. That rage wasn't the problem. It was the response to the problem, the signal, the fire in your bones saying, no more. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation. You're not here to burn the world down. You're here to stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Sacred rage doesn't lash out. It draws a line. It says, this is where I end and you begin. This is what I will no longer carry. This is what I return to sender. And yes, it's messy, but it's also necessary. Because once you feel it fully, you stop apologizing for existing. You stop begging for crumbs and start expecting respect. You stop being loyal to pain and start becoming devoted to truth. You remember that rage is not the enemy. It's the warrior within you waking up. This rage, it's not new. It's ancient. It's your birthright. And now, it's your guide. It tells you what's intolerable. It points to what must be healed. And when you listen, not reactively, but reverently, you become someone who no longer flinches at their own power. You become someone who refuses to die quietly. The fire didn't destroy you. It refined you. You didn't come out of it clean. You came out true. Scarred, yes, but stronger, quieter, but deeper. The fire didn't give you answers. It burned away the lies. It stripped you of what was never yours to carry. It made you meet yourself, not the version they shaped, but the one that always lived beneath. You were never meant to stay in the flames. You were meant to rise from them, not in spite of your pain, but because of it. Because pain taught you presence, taught you how to discern real from fake, truth from performance. It taught you that peace isn't comfort, it's clarity. It's the kind of clarity that doesn't always feel good, but it always sets you free. You are not the pain you endured. You are the soul that lived through it, woke up and chose something better. You are the cycle breaker, the pattern disruptor, the one who rose not with vengeance but with vision. You no longer need to prove your strength. It radiates silently from every part of you that refused to stay broken. Now you carry the fire, not to burn, but to illuminate, to shine light on what others are still hiding from, to warm those who are still healing, to blaze trails where silence once reigned. And that fire, it is holy, it is eternal, it is you. Let them see it, let them feel it, let them wake up, because you did.